The metal creaked as the dog lunged again, jaws snapping against painted steel. The quiet street was broken by the sharp rattle of a mailbox being shaken on its post. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering, unsure whether to intervene. It was not hunger that drove the animal. Its ribs were lean but not hollow. Nor was it play, though his growl was low, guttural, vibrating with something heavier than mischief. Each strike left new dents, flecks of enamel scattered like bone, chips across the sidewalk. From her window, Mrs. Hill pressed a trembling hand to the glass. At 73, her sight was not as sharp as it once had been, but she could read fear in the way the dog's hackles rose, the way its body stiffened before each assault. She recognized the animal. It belonged to the man who lived 2 houses down, a quiet veteran who walked it at odd hours. The dog had always been controlled, restrained, until now. What had driven it to tear at a box of letters as though it were flesh? The autumn air carried the scent of rain-soaked leaves and rust. A breeze lifted a few of the envelopes that had slipped from the cracked door of the mailbox, scattering them like startled birds. The dog paused only to sniff one, then clawed at the metal harder, as if something buried within demanded release. Its eyes were wild yet certain, not lost in confusion but focused with intent. A man in a work jacket crossed the street slowly, his boots scuffing the pavement. He raised a hand to steady the dog's fury with his voice, but no words came. What was there to say to an animal tearing open secrets no one had asked to see? Behind him, the neighbors grew restless. Someone muttered about calling animal control. Another said it was dangerous. Still, none stepped closer. The moment felt larger than a single dog misbehaving. It felt like trespassing into something they were not meant to witness. The dog's teeth finally split the thin metal door. It shoved its muzzle deep, growling, and pulled free a bundle of envelopes bound in a frayed rubber band. They dropped into the dirt, edges smeared with saliva and mud. The dog backed away and sat, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the letters as though it had fulfilled its purpose. The street fell into a strange hush, as if every person present waited for someone else to move first. Mrs. Hill slowly opened her front door, stepping onto the porch, her gaze locked not on the dog but on the bundle. Something about the way the envelopes had been bound tight, deliberate, unnatural, carried a weight that pulled the breath from her chest. She thought of her late husband, who had once worked at the post office, who had warned her in hushed tones that not every letter found its rightful home. She whispered his name under her breath, though no one heard it but the wind. The dog lowered, its head, ears pressed back, as if bracing for what would follow. Its growl had faded into silence, replaced by the stillness of an animal that had delivered a message no one yet understood. The letters lay in the mud, waiting, their presence heavy enough to change the air. No one reached for them. Not yet. And in that pause, dog, neighbors, and sky, all holding their breath. The beginning of something much larger quietly took root. The bundle of damp letters lay between the dog and the people watching, their edges darkening in the soil. No one moved, as though the air itself had pressed down, heavy with the weight of choice. The dog's chest rose and fell, his eyes fixed not on the humans but on the scattered envelopes, as if guarding them. A sparrow landed on the fence, shook the rain from its wings, and the sound of dripping water filled the silence. The street had narrowed into a single moment. Either someone would step forward, or the quiet would break of its own accord. It was Mrs. Hill who bent first, her hand trembling as she reached for the nearest envelope. The dog stiffened, a low growl stirring in his throat, not ferocious but warning. She froze, her fingers just above the paper, the wind tugging at her sleeve. Her body remembered fear she thought she had outlived, the night years ago when her house was broken into, the letters left scattered on her hallway floor, her husband whispering that trust could vanish as quickly as breath. She withdrew her hand and stood still, her eyes wet, not with rain but with something older. Across the street, the man in the work jacket took a step forward. His boots sank slightly in the soft earth, and with each movement, the dog's gaze followed him. He had known this animal for months, passing glances at dawn, nods exchanged with its owner, but there had never been this rawness, this need. The dog's posture was no longer violent. It was pleading, almost insistent, like a creature pointing toward a wound it could not speak of. A gust of wind swept along the road, pulling a single envelope free of the bundle. It tumbled across the dirt until it lodged against the man's boot. He bent to pick it up, but when his fingers closed on the damp paper, his breath caught. The name scrawled across the front was not one he expected, nor one that belonged on this street. The ink was smudged, but the letters were enough to sting recognition into him. The neighbors shifted uneasily, sensing something unspoken pass through him. Mrs. Hill leaned forward, searching his face for clues, but he slipped the letter into his jacket pocket before anyone else could see. His jaw tightened, the kind of tension born of memory rather than present danger. For the first time, the dog turned his eyes away from the letters and onto the man. Watching with unnerving steadiness, the wind eased, leaving a hush broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. The dog stood, shook mud from his coat, and nudged the remaining bundle closer to the man with his nose. It was an offering, not an attack. And in that gesture, the street seemed to tilt. What had been violence moments ago now bore the shape of intent. Mrs. Hill's voice cracked the silence, softer than the breeze. "What is it?" she asked, her tone laced not with curiosity but with dread. The man looked at her, then at the others gathered, but he said nothing. His silence was its own confession, though no one could name the crime. The sky darkened slightly, as clouds drew together, dimming the light. It was not yet storm, but the heaviness of rain to come hovered above them, matching the weight pressing down on their hearts. The dog sat again, gaze unwavering, his body tense with a strange patience. The man finally bent, gathering the rest of the bundle into his hands. The paper was cold, wet, heavier than it should have been. He held it against his chest for a moment, as though measuring the cost of opening it in front of witnesses. Then, without a word, he turned and began to walk toward his house, the dog falling into step beside him like a shadow that had found its master. The neighbors did not follow. They lingered, rooted to the damp pavement, staring at the door that closed behind him. The silence left in their wake was not relief, it was expectation. The uneasy knowledge that something once hidden had been dragged into the open. Inside, the man placed the bundle on his kitchen table. His fingers lingered on the frayed band that held the letters together, but he did not break it. Outside, the dog pressed against the door, waiting, as though what mattered most had not yet been revealed. And then, faintly, through the stillness of the house, came the sound of another envelope sliding free from the stack and hitting the floor. It landed face up. The man turned his head slowly, eyes catching the name written across it. This time, the blood drained from his face. The bundle of letters remained in the mud, damp edges curling as the breeze shifted. No one dared step closer. The dog sat as if it had become a sentinel, chest rising and falling with slow precision, eyes steady on what it had uncovered. The silence pressed against the neighbors, making them restless, as though even the air resisted the weight of those unopened envelopes. It was Mrs. Hill who finally descended from her porch, each step slow, her slippers darkened by the wet ground. She did not reach for the letters but stood before them, peering down as though they might breathe on their own. Behind her, a man muttered about calling the sheriff, his voice carrying more unease than authority. No one answered him. All eyes clung to the dog, whose posture suggested not defiance but the strange finality of a task fulfilled. The rubber band that bound the envelopes was brittle, cracked along its edges, one slip of the wind, and the top letter twisted, revealing a name scrawled in thick black ink. It was not addressed to anyone on this street, not even this town. The realization rippled quietly through those close enough to see. Mailboxes often held the ordinary bills, postcards, noticized, but this had been hidden, stuffed too tightly, as though never meant to be delivered at all. The dog shifted, nose low to the ground, and let out a sound that was not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Something in it resembled urgency. Mrs. Hill's throat tightened. She thought of her late husband again, how he had once spoken of misrouted letters, but never with such gravity. She bent, slowly, knees trembling, and brushed the dirt from the envelope's surface. The handwriting was uneven, harsh, a hand not used to patience. She felt, without knowing why, that she should not read further in public view. A crow landed on the sagging fence nearby, its wings cutting the air like a warning. The dog's ears pricked, head turning sharply, body tense. The bird gave a single cry, sharp and hollow, before falling silent. The street held its breath again. Something was shifting, an invisible thread pulling them from the comfort of bystander curiosity into a space they could not retreat from. From across the street, the veteran the dogs owned, his steps were uneven, as though the earth itself resisted him. He looked not at his neighbors, not at Mrs. Hill, but at the bundle on the ground. His face was carved from stone, but his hands betrayed him, flexing, trembling. The dog turned to him, not with guilt but with the heavy calm of a messenger who had delivered what could not stay hidden. He did not speak at once. He crouched, hand brushing his dog's back, grounding himself in the animal's warmth. His eyes, weary and shadowed, lifted to the neighbors now gathering closer. They searched his face for an explanation, but he offered none. Instead, he reached toward the letters, stopped short, then pulled back, as though the act of touching them would confirm something long feared. Mrs. Hill, her hand still hovering over the envelopes, glanced at him. For a fleeting moment, she saw not the quiet man who avoided gatherings, but someone carrying years of silence too heavy to share. The dog pressed closer to his leg, eyes unwavering. Whatever had been revealed, here was no accident. The wind shifted again, scattering brittle leaves across the pavement. They skittered like restless fingers, brushing the bundle, tugging at the corners. The veteran closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening, and when he opened them again, he gave the faintest shake of his head, whether to his dog, to the crowd, or to himself, no one could tell. The rubber band strained, snapping faintly, and the letters spread just enough to reveal more inked names, more destinations that did not belong here. The onlookers leaned in, caught between dread and necessity. No one spoke. It was as if the entire street had become a confessional, and these letters were its reluctant truth. The veteran rose, shoulders stooped, and with a voice low enough that it nearly broke against the still air, he said only, "Don't touch them." Then he turned, guiding the dog with him, leaving the bundle untouched in the mud. His words left behind more unease than comfort, more questions than answers. Mrs. Hill remained, her hand trembling at her side. She had never felt so certain that silence carried its own danger. The envelopes, fragile and damp, seemed almost to pulse with the weight of what they carried, and in the long hush that followed, the sound of another door opening somewhere down the street hinted that this secret would not remain contained much longer. The letters remained where they had fallen, dampened by the earth, their edges curled, and darkened by saliva. The dog sat perfectly still beside them, chest rising and falling in deliberate rhythm, eyes never leaving the bundle. Neighbors shifted uneasily on porches and sidewalks, whispering in voices meant to be low but carrying. Across the quiet street, no one reached forward. No one dared to disturb the silence that seemed to expand around the animal and the scattered paper, as though the very air was waiting for someone to betray the moment. Mrs. Hill's shoes tapped lightly against the wooden porch as she stepped down, her breath caught in her throat. The chill evening wind tugged at her cardigan, but she barely noticed. Her gaze was drawn, not to the dog, but to the strange rubber band that bound the letters together. It was too tight, too precise. The edges of the envelopes pressed unnaturally, smooth. Whoever had sealed them like that had meant for them never to be touched. She thought of her husband again, his warnings whispered in the quiet of night, and a part of her wanted to turn back, but she didn't. The dog shifted its weight, lowering its head until its muzzle hovered inches from the dirt. A low rumble passed through its chest, not a threat but a warning. A sound that held back the world rather than dared it closer. Across the street, the man in the work jacket took a hesitant step forward, his boots pressing into the gravel. He raised his hand slowly, not toward the letters but toward the dog itself, as though asking permission. For a moment, the animal's eyes flicked to him, and in that glance there was something more than instinct, something closer to duty. The wind stirred again, sending one loose envelope tumbling across the ground until it caught against Mrs. Hill's shoe. She bent her hand, trembling, and lifted it carefully. The paper was damp, the ink smudged, but beneath the smears she could see faint lines of handwriting, dense, hurried, the kind of script that hides secrets more than it reveals them. Her breath deepened as she realized these were not ordinary letters. The dog's eyes followed her hand as if to ensure she saw, as if this was what it had meant all along. Gasps rose from the small cluster of neighbors when she clutched the envelope tighter, as though holding a relic. Someone muttered that it wasn't her business. Another said it should be left to the police. But their voices sounded faint, like echoes against the wind. Mrs. Hill's heart was beating too loudly in her ears to hear them clearly. For the first time in years she felt the weight of decision pressing against her chest. Age had slowed her body, dimmed her sight, but it had not dulled the sense that this moment mattered in ways none of them could yet grasp. The dog rose suddenly, shaking off the stillness, and padded toward her. Its paws left dark impressions in the wet soil, and the murmurs of the neighbors hushed. Mrs. Hill did not flinch as it approached, though her fingers tightened around the envelope. The animal stopped at her feet, lifted its head, and pressed its muzzle lightly against her hand. The warmth of its breath brushed across her skin, not a demand but a plea. In that touch, something passed between them, an understanding to raw. 4 words, too urgent for dismissal. Overhead, the clouds thickened, dimming the last threads of light. The street grew quieter still, the atmosphere heavier, as though the coming night would bring not rest but revelation. Mrs. Hill glanced at the bundle of unopened letters lying in the mud, their silence louder than any word spoken. She could feel the weight of her neighbors' stares on her back, the pull of their fear mingled with curiosity. Yet all she saw was the dog, standing close, its body taut with a strange expectation. Her hand loosened slightly around the envelope, the edges now softened by her touch. She wanted to ask aloud what she already knew. What secret had this animal dragged into the open? What shadow lingered inside these folded sheets of paper? But she said nothing. Her silence was answer enough, and it seemed to deepen the quiet that had settled over them all. Then, from somewhere down the block, came the faint slam of a car door. Heads turned sharply, conversations died in their throats, and the dog's ears pricked, its muscles tightening in alert. The sound carried with it the suggestion of someone returning, or perhaps someone who had been waiting all along. And just like that, the fragile stillness fractured. The sound of the car door echoed faintly, then faded into the stillness of the street. The dog remained at Mrs. Hill's side, ears forward, body taut, its gaze fixed on the end of the block where shadows pressed against the last traces of light. Neighbors held their breath, as though expecting someone to appear, yet no figure emerged. The silence that followed was heavier than before, and into it fell the rustle of the wind, tugging at the bundle of letters strewn in the mud. At last, Mrs. Hill bent slowly and gathered them into her hands. The rubber band bit against her skin. As she pulled it away, revealing envelopes marked with dates that spanned years, their ink faded but not erased. She opened the first with fingers that trembled not from frailty but from the weight of knowing. The handwriting inside was jagged, urgent, the words hurried as if written in hiding. She read only a few lines before her lips parted in disbelief. They spoke of disappearances, of names long whispered in town but never spoken aloud, of truths buried beneath official silence. her eyes lifted, glazed with tears not of grief but of recognition. She turned the letter slightly toward the crowd, though no one dared step forward. The neighbors' murmurs returned, hushed and frightened, as if the words on the page might unravel more than they were ready to carry. Yet the dog stood calm, watching her, its breathing steady, its eyes no longer wild but certain. It had brought her to this moment, and now it waited. The man in the work jacket finally approached, his boots pressed into the wet soil beside her, and for the first time his voice broke the silence. "They're not just letters," he said quietly, his gaze on the dog. "They're confessions. Someone wanted them hidden." His words carried no drama, only the rough weight of truth, and, though no one answered, the shift in the air was unmistakable. What had seemed like madness from an animal was, in the end, a kind of revelation. Mrs. Hill lowered the pages, her hand brushing across the dog's head, her palm resting against its fur. The animal leaned into her touch, not in need but in recognition of shared burden. Around them, the neighbors stepped back, some retreating toward their homes, others standing rigid in the gathering dusk. No one spoke of what to do next. No one asked who would claim the letters. That silence was its own answer. This was no longer about property or noise, but about what had been uncovered and who would carry it forward. The street darkened, the first stars pressed faintly through the clouded sky, and the air grew cool with the promise of night. The letters in her hand rustled softly, fragile against the rising breeze. She thought of her husband again, of his warnings whispered years ago, warnings she had not wanted to believe. She felt both the ache of regret and the clarity of release. This was the truth he had feared would surface, and it had taken a creature's persistence to deliver it. The dog moved away from her then, stepping into the center of the street. It paused, nose lifted toward the shifting wind, before lowering its head and pacing slowly down the block. Its body carried no trace of rage now, only purpose, as though it had done what it came to do. Mrs. Hill watched it go, the bundle of letters pressed against her chest, and for a moment she felt the strange symmetry of it all. An animal, silent and instinctive, had spoken more clearly than any human voice behind her. The murmurs of the neighbors drifted like smoke, scattered and uncertain. Some would choose to forget, others would wonder, but she knew the weight of the pages in her hands could not be erased. She turned back toward her porch, each step steady, her heart slower now, her breath deep. She had no answers yet, only the certainty that the story was not over. The cost of truth was heavy, but it was hers to bear. By the time she reached her door, the dog had vanished into the night. The street stood empty, quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the whisper of unseen things carried on the wind. She set the letters gently on her table, her hand lingering on them as though they were both burden and gift. Through the window, the faint glow of dusk gave way to darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, low and steady. Before silence reclaimed the night. Mrs. Hill closed her eyes, listening to the stillness, knowing it was the kind of silence that would linger, not absence, but presence, a reminder that some truths cannot remain buried forever. And on the table, under the dim light of her kitchen, the stack of letters waited, fragile yet unyielding, as if holding in their paper skin the weight of a nation's forgotten memory.